Alex Dennis. Thank you for joining us. Well-connected billionaire Jeffrey Epstein is now facing new sex trafficking charges, accused of operating a ring involving dozens of underage girls. Federal prosecutors in New York charged the 66-year-old earlier this morning. He is now facing 1 count of sex trafficking and 1 count of sex trafficking conspiracy. This new indictment comes 11 years after Epstein reached a deal with attorneys in Florida to avoid a similar charge. CBS News' Hillary Lane reports.
In a 14-page indictment, federal prosecutors have charged Jeffrey Epstein with sex trafficking and conspiracy.
The underage girls were initially recruited to provide Epstein with massages and often did so nude or partially nude. These massages became increasingly sexual in nature.
The indictment says Epstein sexually exploited dozens of minors as young as 14 in his homes in New York and Florida. And from at least 2002 to at least 2005, he recruited dozens of girls to engage in sex acts and gave them hundreds of dollars in cash. Over the weekend, federal agents arrested the 66-year-old hedge fund manager after he returned from Paris and raided his mansion in New York. Epstein has associated with powerful people, including former President Bill Clinton and Donald Trump when he was a private citizen. Back in 2002, Mr. Trump told New York Magazine, quote, "I've known Jeff for 15 years, terrific guy, and that he, quote, likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side." This is the second time federal prosecutors have gone after Epstein. Back in 2008, there was outrage after federal prosecutors struck a plea deal without consulting his victims.
They deserve their day in court. We are proud to be standing up for them by bringing this indictment.
New York prosecutors say Epstein worked and conspired with others, including employees and associates. It's unclear if others will face charges. Hillary Lane, CBS News, New York.
And for more now, I want to bring in Casey Frank and Vinoo Varghese. Casey is a senior editor for investigations at the Miami Herald, and Vinoo is a criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor with expertise in federal white-collar crimes. We also want to note that the Herald has been out in front covering Epstein's case, and because of that, Casey, I want to start with you. These are new charges being brought against Epstein, but how do they differ from the state charges he pleaded guilty to in Florida, and why does this difference make a difference?
Well, they're different from the charges that he pleaded to in Florida in that those were very minor charges that carried with them a year in the county jail. These are charges that could put him in prison for the rest of his life. But other than that, the actual alleged criminal behavior is very similar. I think it underscores the fact that in 2007 and 2008, the case was handled in a way that was very different from the way it's being handled today. And I think part of that is because of the Miami Herald's reporting. Part of that is kind of a shift in the culture that came with the Me Too movement. Victims are being listened to in a way that they weren't back in 2007 and 2008.
And that's interesting to hear you say that, Casey. The deal Epstein made in Florida has been widely criticized really as being too lenient. After pleading guilty, Epstein spent just more than a year in jail, and he was allowed to leave frequently for work. Remind us again how Epstein was able to get this deal and avoid more time actually behind bars.
Well, Mr. Epstein, who of course is very wealthy, was able to hire a number of very high-powered attorneys, and they worked the refs, meaning the U.S. Attorney's Office, very hard. We've examined emails that show the extent to which the attorneys for Mr. Epstein really dictated the terms of the non-prosecution agreement that caused this case to be shifted to state court, where it was ultimately resolved. We've also seen through our reporting the ways in which attorneys and private investigators intimidated the victims, and yes, even the U.S. prosecutors, but especially the victims, whose social media accounts were examined very closely, and these young women were grilled mercilessly in a way that really nobody would want their child to be treated by the court system rather.
So, Vinoo, I want to turn to you and talk about this from a legal standpoint. Does the plea deal in Florida protect Epstein in any way in the case he faces now in New York?
No, generally, plea deals with one U.S. Attorney's Office does not bind another United States Attorney's Office. But understand there's a lot of problems here, and this is a potential minefield for the prosecutors, the federal prosecutors here in New York. First, there's no statute of limitations on this kind of charge. That cuts both ways. The reason there was a statute of limitations, or there should be a statute of limitations in cases like this, is that it protects both the defendant and the alleged victim, because then you can go back and get cell phone records and things like that. Here you have alleged cash payments made. And if the case is based upon these former employees, well, Mr. Epstein's going to have, and his lawyers are going to have a field day with that without the corroboration. For all we know, the United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District of Florida, Miami office, they may not have felt they had a prosecutable federal crime. I have the indictment here. I'm reading through it. And what I'm not seeing is actual sex trafficking. What it says is that there are arrangements made for him to have girls ready in Florida and arrangements for girls to have ready in New York. Well, it's a line that the statute actually requires the crossing of interstate or using a means of interstate to do this. Now, if he's flying home and these are his homes, he's not flying to other states to have sex with young girls. He's going to his home. So the question is, I mean, from his lawyer's point of view, they're going to challenge this legally in a number of different ways.
And what would you say when you were talking about the victims, wanting them to have a limitation for them? Why is that a pro for them?
Well, because, again, as an attorney operating in federal court and criminal court, we don't use the term victim. These are alleged victims. These are complainants, first of all. So the reason for that is that it protects them as well, because let's say something actually did happen. When you have too much time, a defendant now can say, where's your proof, right? This person didn't go to authorities back when it happened, and the statutes in these states allow for them to go up until they're 18. Well, they didn't go, a lot of these people, when they were 18. And now also, Jeff Berman, the U.S. attorney here, also did something very interesting, a la the prosecuting attorney in the R. Kelly case. He went out in front of the thing and he said, call us if you've been victimized. This is similar to the prosecutor in the R. Kelly case in Chicago asking people to come forward. Well, then, you're now inviting people to jump on the Jeff Epstein bandwagon. And now you're going to open up potential Pandora's box of people to come in and a bunch of potential false allegations.
So, Casey, let's circle back around. Your colleague, Julie K. Brown, has really been in front of this, having a piece out now saying that this is a nervous time for Epstein's friends and enablers. What kind of domino effects do you think could be a result of these new charges now?
Well, I guess we'll find out moving forward. This was a very sophisticated operation. Mr. Epstein had schedulers, he had pilots, he had all sorts of people who seemingly knew what he was doing. And one would think that those folks could be in jeopardy because of these charges levied against Mr. Epstein today. Now, Mr. Epstein also had many influential friends from President Trump, before he was the president, to former President Bill Clinton. And some of those folks, including the former President Clinton, traveled on Mr. Epstein's plane, visited his island in the Caribbean, and may have been privy to some of his activities. Now, being friends with Mr. Epstein is in no way a crime, but it could make things uncomfortable if such people are called as witnesses in the proceedings going forward. And that's what I want to be looking at, as well as whether Mr. Acosta, who arranged the deal in South Florida 10 years ago, is called and put under oath to describe the thought process that went into negotiating this non-prosecution agreement, and also his decision to keep that agreement secret from the victims, which is probably the most controversial element of this whole case.
And of course, Acosta, you mentioned there, is President Trump's labor secretary, so that's something to note as well.
Correct.
Casey Frank and Vinoo Varghese, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.